What is going on, YouTube people? Northeast Ohio Cards and Comics here. And today I have a special guest, David from Comic Book Investments. I've been watching David's channel for probably 5 or so months now. I reached out to him to have him on to talk a little shop on comic book market and just the whole wonderful wide world of comics. I'm going to throw it over to David real quick here to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his channel. So, David, give the people a quick rundown on your background.
Hi, my name is David. I have a YouTube channel, Comic Book Investments. I started pretty much the beginning of the year. I'm a comic book dealer, have been for about 13 years. This is like my full-time job. This is what I do. I grew up with comics pretty much my whole life. My dad was a comic dealer, big dealer in the 80s and 90s, retired in the early 2000s. And yeah, so this is what I do every day.
And you've been doing YouTube for, you said, about a little over about what, 6, 8 months. You started what, right at around Christmas time?
Right in the beginning of the year, pretty much.
Okay. What um what brought that on? Was it just oh, let me do this, I'm bored, or was that like a plan thing? Like, what made you go down the content creation route?
So I wanted to do a uh, a YouTube channel for a while, like many many years, but I figured no one's gonna listen to me. I'm just another guy. Like, who cares? Like, so I was gonna do it. I was gonna do a finance channel with my girlfriend, and I was gonna write the scripts, and then she was gonna be the spokesman, I guess, the host or whatever. And so, because it's like I have all the knowledge, but I think they'd be more interested in watching her than they would me. So, but then as time went on, I found that she was like less interested in the idea. We're really busy. So then one day I was like, F it, I'm just going to do it myself. And so I wanted to mix like comics and finances. So that's why I have those financial Fridays that I usually release. Um, and my comics are more geared towards the financial and investment side of comics than, hey, look at this cool character that came out and let's read the story type of thing.
Yeah, and that's a lot what drew me to your channel too, because I think we're very similar in the way, like, you'll do. David does like these market researches of, like, top 10 X-Men books, or top five, Spider-Man books, or prices going up, prices going down, and I do a lot of the same content. But I like that you're data driven, like you're using numbers to back up. You're not just like throwing out like, oh, yeah, go buy this one. It's, oh, well, here's what the market's been doing on this one type stuff. And I also like your unique perspective because you are a comic book dealer. So from a content creation watching perspective, like, that's not something that you see a lot of on YouTube. Like, I think you have a unique perspective because you're coming at it from that very particular angle.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I practice what I preach. I would never tell someone to do something that I thought was like a bad idea. I do pretty much. I follow everything all the advice I give. And like you're saying, I'm a dealer. Like, I have to make a living. This is what I do for work. So I can't go out there and be, pushing out bad deals, because then I'd be broke. So, um, yeah. So it's definitely like I find it kind of like challenging with some of the people that watch, because there's a lot of hype channels out there that hype up different books, and I always have to like bring that down and be like, and then people kind of get up mad. They're like, "Oh no, this book is going to go to the moon," and I'm like, "Based off of what?" Because someone
Yeah.
says.
A lot of times they go to the moon, but they don't stay there for very long.
Hmm. And then you're
You
left
know,
holding the bag.
Yeah, it's like, I always joke the sports card market's a big game of hot potato. Like, you get it, you wait for it to go up a little bit, and then you move it on to the next guy, and then, before the music stops, essentially, and
Yeah.
you're stuck holding it. Um, so much like the sports card market, the comic book market, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I was tracking it loosely since COVID started, and then really dug in about 8 months ago at the beginning of the year. But the pandemic was pretty good for the comic book market, correct? Much
Mhm.
like the sports card market.
Yeah, and this is like, I have a friend that sells Nike shoes. Like, that's what he does. He's a reseller of shoes, Nikes usually, and it was very good for him too. And I'm like, I thought all these people were starving and jobless and like can't pay rent, and now they're all buying. Like, as soon as the stimulus check came out, massive spike in business. Just like every stimulus check, spike in business, and it's just like, oh, these people spending their their hard-earned government money on comics. So
Yeah, I mean, I was doing the same thing. I think the nostalgia factor really kicked in for a lot of people during that time. I did it with sports cards, and I did it with, I was buying boxes of Marvel trading cards to have something to like open and put sets together while I was stuck in lockdown, and then that
that's
set me down
another
the
thing.
path. That set me down the path to like, oh well, let me look at some comic books too, and then that kind of got the ball rolling on that for me. It seemed like, and the sports car market kind of followed this same thing. Like from April till about the end of the year into the early part of the winter, like it was going nuts. Both markets were kind of, people were like, "Oh man, this is crazy. What's going on here?" And then it seemed like for you guys on the comic book side of things, like come spring, it really went like a whole nother 5 levels in like
Yeah.
a 3 week period. Do you know why? Do you have any idea or insight into why it went like absolutely nuclear? Like it was already going good, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
it was just like we're going even crazier. You thought the last 6 months were crazy? Like look out.
Yeah, it did yeah, it just went insane. Like I would say right around the end of March, like usually April and May were like just insane prices. Things just like doubling from just 3 months ago. And I'm not talking doubling from $10 to $20, talking doubling from like 3 to 6 grand, you know. Um I think it was a lot of things. I think with interest rates being so low, I think that had to do with a lot of things, because then borrowing money became so cheap, and then, yeah, maybe people would, take refinancing and taking money out and putting their money into something else. I just, I think it was just a whole new, like crypto was at like an all-time high then. Maybe people were taking money out of crypto, putting it around other things. I also think during that time, a lot of businesses started popping up from Silicon Valley that had to deal with comics and cards. Like, have you ever heard of, Rally or Otis or Alt?
Yeah, all the micro share places
Yeah, all
kind of
those
came
started
in.
popping up, and they got billions of, or not billions, millions of dollars from, like, Silicon Valley, and so they had to buy up a bunch of stuff, and there's, you know, the video game market started really being pushed and, being propped up. I don't know, I think there's this I think what happened was there was a new set of people coming into the market, and those were not collectors, those were straight up financial investors. And I think that's because a big Wall Street company, Blackstone, bought CGC for $500 million.
Mhm.
So I just think there's a whole new slew of brand new people that go, hey, cards, comics, they can be as good as stocks. So I don't know. That's like
Yeah,
kind of like my take.
for you being a dealer side of things, like during that period, like during that, like what was that, like a 30 to 90 day run where things were going crazy every day in the comic book market, were you seeing new buyers come to you? Like were you seeing a lot of new business, or was it more people that were already existing clients or people that have bought before, like doubling, tripling down on existing things? Or was it like, hey, I've never really done business with you or whatever, I'm in the market for this, all of a sudden someone referred me to you or whatever? Were you seeing a lot of like actual new blood come in
Yeah, I was
from
seeing a
your
lot of
perspective?
new blood. During those times, it was man, I will tell you, the money was rolling in. And, like and I was like I was because I do this with my brother, and I was like, "Oh my gosh." I was like because, 2019 and 20 weren't, like, the best years, but then all of a sudden, the beginning towards the end of last year and then this year, just, like, it was ridiculous how much, like, stuff we're selling just nonstop, and then come, like, July, it just crashed, and it wasn't like the prices crashed, it was we don't sell as much stuff. Like, the amount of volume that we do just went to, like, a quarter of what it was at its peak, and it
This and the sports car market did the same thing, but like a month sooner.
mm,
Like the sports card market really tanked, like really late spring into the
mm,
beginning parts of the summer, like March, April, May, June. Like as you guys were really hitting the tail end of your stride, the sports card market was starting to dip down. Really, the second the world started opening up again, like vaccines started rolling out in March and April, people started feeling like a little bit more comfortable going about their daily routines, it felt like it went like this, and then like you guys were
Yeah.
about 2 months behind that
I
of
need to
everything
start
going
watching
down.
the card market to see what the comics are gonna do.
It really feels like it's a leading indicator in some regards. I was joking with oh, I was on with, I don't know if you know Reggie Collects at all on
Yeah,
YouTube. I was on his channel about a month or so ago, and we were talking about this because it was the same thing. We David and I were talking about grading prior to hitting record on this, and grading was the same way. Like, PSA had this massive backlog. All the grading companies were a big mess, and now you see it on the comic book side the same way. Like, it seems like every day I see people complaining about how backed up CGC is, and like, oh my god, they have my books forever. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's what the sports card world was like 6 months ago.
is it this grading sports card market picked back up?
The sports card market has leveled out probably the last 2 to 3 months, and it's kind of showing signs of normalcy again, I would say.
Okay.
Like, it feels like it's getting back to normal.
Yeah, and
Like,
I'll say
prices aren't going absolutely insane for no reason. It's much more performance based. It's not totally hype driven.
yeah,
So it feels like it's getting back to more of a performance based market versus a reactionary slash hype based market.
yeah.
So
I also think that I think this kind of all started a little bit like the push it in this direction was when Logan Paul bought that Pokemon for like 300,000 or something like that, and then that just like all those people started buying everything under the sun. It's like, what? Pokemon's worth this? Okay, let's buy Pokemon cards. Oh, well, that's all gone. So let's buy Magic. Oh, well, what about comics? What about cards? All these people like they had no business in any collectible field whatsoever were like jumping aboard. You know,
yeah, it was the race to be first on the thing that hadn't gone up in value yet.
yeah, and
It's like,
and then
oh, all this. Well, the Marvel trading card had its day too. It was the same thing. It was like, oh, well, if sports cards are going nuts, why isn't this like first Spider-Man card worth a lot of money? And then I think actually that helped bring some sport. Like, a lot of sports card people jumped into the, not a lot, but a portion jumped into the Marvel card boom, which happened in January and February. And I think that actually helped bridge the gap to go the next step of like, well, wait, if I'm buying a Spider-Man PSA 10, why don't I just buy a Spider-Man CGC,
yeah.
of whatever book that you want?
And now, is the Marvel trading cards have they kind of went bust, or are they still kind of
They're not bust, but they've done the same thing. They spiked way up and they have essentially leveled off. Some are actually still doing pretty well. PMGs, which are precious metal gems, those are numbered cards from the Fleer retro sets and metal sets from the mid '90s and the mid 2000s. Those sell for astronomical sums of money still. But like the '90 Marvel Universe stuff, a PSA
trade?
10 Spider-Man is still a $300 card, which, prior to 8 months ago, that was, in a PSA 10, you know, if you would have looked at that in November, it was probably like a $35, $40 card.
Oh
So,
wow, that's
but it
still
was in January and February and March, that was a $1,500 to $2,000 card.
wow, interesting. Yeah, because I just remember as a kid going to the comic shop, and they'd always have boxes and boxes of the unsold cards and comics that or comic cards that no one wanted, or it'd be like the Turtles movie like
Mhm.
card sets you could get, and I would get those. I remember buying boxes of the Turtles, the first movie they made cards of them, a box for 99 cents, like the whole box with whatever how many packs it came, 12, 18, something like that,
Yeah,
and
stuff like that really didn't see a big run up. A little bit in sealed wax. Not like the Marvel cards did though, like 90 specifically. 90 was the one that really people really gravitated towards because it was like the first real set of Marvel card. There was some earlier stuff, but like comic images and some stickers and stuff like that. But that 90 Marvel Universe set seemed to be the one that everyone gravitated towards.
mm. So I have a question for you, because this has happened. I did a video on it. Your thoughts on PWCC?
I did a bunch of videos on this. I My general take is it was a preemptive strike by eBay because they knew PWCC was leaving.
Mhm.
Because they're shill bidding. I mean, I'm sure you're well aware. They're shill bidding all over eBay all the time with a lot
Right.
of the big consigners. So all of a sudden, you're going to crack down on PWCC and nobody else. and it also happens to coincide with PWCC's planning on launching their own selling platform this fall.
Is that
So to
to
me,
basically hurt them?
yeah, I think it was okay. Cool, you're leaving. It was like, oh, you're not going to quit, you're fired type thing.
Mm,
That's how I viewed it.
interesting. Um, yeah, because I remember when I was trying to sell my cards, I'd always look at like recent sold on eBay, and I'm like, I almost used PWCC because like I was like, man, the exact same card and the exact same grade would sell for twice as much if it was through PWCC, and I never understood why. I'm like, am I missing something? This is some kind of weird variant that I'm not aware of, and like be the same grade or whatever. So I was like, yeah, I'll just send it to them, and then like, you know, even if gets close to what the previous one did, it's better than me selling on my own. But then like
Yeah.
the turnaround times were too long. I was like, "Ah, I'd rather have the money now. So I just priced it fair.
Yeah,
So
so I think it was we know you're leaving, and it was like a masterful PR move by eBay to basically really put them on their back foot before they even launched, because they're a massive force in the sports card industry in regards to selling cards. Like they were the number one seller of sports cards on eBay by a mile.
yeah, yeah, they
So they
were.
have their whole vaulting system and all that stuff. And then they just launched fixed price sales this week. So you can list at buy it now prices, and then their auction platform launches. I don't know if they have a hard date on it, but I think sometime in October
Yeah,
it's
we're
going to
trying
launch.
to launch our own auction site. Hopefully, January will be the first one.
Oh,
For
nice.
yeah.
Is it going to be more like a premier auction, like where you run like like a set things like for like a 2 week period, or
Yeah, it'd be basically like people can sign with us, send it to us, and then we list it in auction, and we do them like quarterly, hopefully work up to monthly type of thing.
nice,
So yeah, that's what
nice.
we're gonna do. I mean, sure, most of the times it's gonna be our own stuff that we're selling in the beginning.
Yeah, just to build the base.
Yeah, because it's you have to convince someone to leave. So there's like heritage auctions. That's like the big
Mhm.
one. Then you have like Comic Link and Comic Connect. Those are the other big ones. And then you have a couple smaller ones. But you have to convince someone like, hey, don't give your book to them. Give it to me, right? And the only thing that really that the person that has the book cares about is like, well, how much money am I going to get for this? You know, they're
Yeah,
willing to make a little few percentage drops if like our customer service is really good, but that's about all they care about is like how much money am I going to get, and you know, and that really depends on how many customers you have. So it's really hard to like break into something when you're starting from the ground level.
yeah, because especially like regardless of the ones you named off, just competing against eBay alone would be difficult because anyone can throw it up there on eBay. Obviously, high dollar stuff. There's a lot of different shenanigans that you have to deal with: shipping, returns,
Yeah,
chargebacks, like all the just normal eBay shenanigans that you have to deal with on a daily basis. So not have to deal with that, I completely understand why people use consigners, but
yeah,
um, just to compete against eBay alone, I think would be hard, just because they're especially for like mid to lower end stuff. Obviously,
exactly.
high end's a different game.
It's definitely very very hard to compete with that, but that's kind of like what we've been working on for the last 3 4 years.
That
So
would be very different. I could not even imagine trying to figure that out. Like all the systems that would have to go into place to
oh my gosh,
make that all work.
it's like building an auction site from scratch is like super hard. Like we were just talking to a developer today, and it's just like the tiniest little things. It's just like, okay, what if someone bids, but they both bid at the same time? How does our system calculate that stuff and make sure like people's bids get in at the same time? I mean, I don't do developing stuff, so that's all them. But it's like
Yeah,
he has to come to these ideas. It's like, okay, how do you want me to code this to work? And yeah, it's just a
just
kind
things
of
that you would never even have to think of,
yeah.
like to consider or whatever.
Mhm.
So obviously you're a dealer. Do you have like an actual personal collection like off to the side, or is like, is everything in your stash, available at the right price type situation? Or do you have like a no, like I'm setting this stuff aside. I don't ever want to sell this, or I don't want to sell this for 10, 15, 20 years or whatever.
Pretty much everything that we have is for sale. When I started this business, I had to sell my personal comic collection that I built up over my life, and then yeah, pretty much I have few things. Like I'm talking about less than 10 things that are like in my personal collection. And they're more sentimental value than actual value.
Mhm.
But pretty much everything. If there's something like there's a couple pieces that we have that we really like, and we put those at an astronomical price if someone wants to pay for it. But those usually are like original art type stuff, like one of a kinds. It's not going to
Mhm.
be like a comic
Super
book. It's like,
unique.
yeah, a comic book. It's like, oh, I got this comic and an 8.0. It's like, okay, well, we could buy another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
That
was
my
like, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, and that was like the interesting moment was I worked really, really hard to get my Hulk 181, and then I had to part with it. And the interesting thing was like, oh man, not my Hulk 181, because in my mind it was years and years of work doing all this kind of stuff to save money. But then we started in the business. I remember our first year we got like two or three of them, and I'm like, huh, oh okay,
No, I go through the same thing on the sports card side of things. You become, and maybe you don't have this problem because you've been doing like the dealer thing longer, so you've detached yourself more. It's like you buy a card that you have literally no attachment to whatsoever. You just buy it because you like the player, you like the grade, you thought it was a good value, and it has potential to go up over the next X amount of time. So you buy it with no pre-connection to the card at all, and then all of a sudden you have it for like a week, and then you're like, oh man, I really don't want to let that go. Like, this, that, or the other thing. And it's like, should I not? Like I bought a card for a little over $2,000, like July 1st. I had the opportunity to sell it a month later for $3,400. And I had no attachment to this card, to this player, nothing. And I had to like agonize over it. And then eventually I'm just like, what are you doing, you dummy? Like, you're gonna make a $1,400 profit on this card. Just sell it and then pull the trigger on it. But do you ever have that problem? Like, do you find yourself ever becoming attached, or have you been doing this long enough that you
I
could be
have
like
found
kind of separate?
whenever I find myself about to buy something that I have any remotely could fall in love with this piece, I try to not buy it because I know that my emotions are clouding my judgment of making money. So, but but if it's something like it's never with comics because I know with comics, like I said, there's millions of them printed, so it's like name a comic, Spider-Man 1. I've already had a bunch of them, in various grades. I know eventually I'll get the same one again. It usually comes down to one of a kinds. So there was this Ghost Rider piece that I really liked, and I bought it because I liked it, and it sat for like 5, 6 years, which wasn't bad because it was hanging on my wall. But then one day someone came around and actually did buy it, and we didn't really make that much money on it. We like barely broke even, and so, but I was like, "Oh man, I'm sad to see this go." Like, and now in my mind, I'm like, "All right, whenever I get rich, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna find that piece and I'm gonna buy it."
I'm gonna buy back.
Yeah. So it's like it's better just not to buy to begin with, because when I first saw it, I was like, "Ooh, that's kinda cool." If I think it's cool, other people will think it's cool. But there was really no money in that piece. Um,
I always, my one of my sayings on the sports card side of things is, and I think people get confused about this because they won't. People are afraid to take profits. I think sometimes, and you see this on the comic book side too, because you're like, oh, but like it could keep going up, and I'm like, yeah, but it could not. So if you're up 40%, just sell it. And then my saying is that like they let you buy this stuff back. Like once you sell it, they actually let you later in life go buy the same thing back
yeah,
again. And I
yeah,
think people forget about that sometimes. They're like, "Oh, if I let it go, I'm never gonna have it back again." And I'm like, "There's 5,000 of those cards in a
yeah,
PSA 10 or in a CGC 98 or whatever. You'll be able to find one again, and this stuff goes up and goes back down and goes back up and goes back down again.
yeah.
There'll be a point in time that you can re-enter the market if you really like it that much to own it again."
I talked to a guy, he was on his 3rd time rebuilding his collection. He had a collection when he was a kid. I think he sold it in his mid-20s, and then, like, some time passes, like 5 or 6 years or something, and he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna start over again." Starts over, but then, like, life happens. Oh, I need the money. And a lot of people, it's like this. It's like they don't. Sometimes they'll sell one or two things, but sometimes when they're out, I need it all gone, and they'll sell their entire collection. And then I was talking to him. He's like, "Yeah, this is my 3rd time. I'm rebuilding it again." And I'm like, maybe just sell a few pieces next time, so you don't have to start from scratch every time.
Yeah. Yeah, keep the stuff that, pick a couple, cherry pick a couple to at least give you a foundation to start from. That would be I
Yeah.
couldn't imagine restarting like my sports card collection, or even my comic book collection isn't huge, but it's decent enough that I couldn't imagine just restarting
But
it.
it's every time you start, you remember what those prices were that you paid for 'em back in the day,
Yeah.
and then on top of that, it gets more and more expensive, and that's why I try to explain to people, it's like, that's why comics are a good investment. You can't just say you're making like 50K a year, average salary, and then say 10 years down the line, the average salary is like 60 or 65K. You cannot buy the exact same books again. They're going to be much higher than the rate of actual inflation, right? They'll go up way more. Like a book that's maybe $1,000, 10 years ago, it's not going to be $1,000, you know, in another 10 years, if you buy the right book.
Yeah.
So,
And that's, we were talking before we hit record. A big reason why I came into the comic book market from sports cards. One, I truly have passion for comic books. I loved them as a kid growing up. But from an investment standpoint, to me, they seem like if you're buying the right stuff, if you're buying like blue chip keys, even into the early modern age, it just feels so safe as long as you're not looking to quick flip it. Like if you coming in and buying and saying, and as long as you're not buying at like the tops of the peaks and saying, okay, I am willing to hold an ASM 300 for the next 10 years, to me, that feels like a pretty safe place to park
yeah.
cash into, stuff on that level. The more modern stuff, I'm not so sure about, but like that, like the early 2000s to mid 90s backwards. And then obviously the super old stuff, but some of that stuff, even in low grades, a lot of people are priced out of, when you start
Yeah.
getting back in the golden age, and even a lot of silver age stuff now is expensive, even in mid to low grades when you look at some of these prices.
Well, it comes down to supply and demand. There's a lot more demand coming in now. And with the newer stuff, I'm sure you've seen it in cards. People buy like a box of the next, tops football thing. They open them all up, send them all to PSA, get all nines and tens, right?
Hmm.
And it's like the same with comics. I've seen people literally get in a comic shop, get in like a distribution box, take out like 10 or 20 of them, all going to CGC. Where they're all going to come back? They're all going to come back 9/8. So it's like there's just not only do they like the print runs of comics these days are nothing compared to they used to be in the 80s and 90s, even before. So they're very low print runs comparatively. But you have to think that like they're all perfect grades now. No one's going to damage the comics. The reason why old comics are worth something is kids actually read them.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of one of the things I want to touch on. So, someone new coming in, like, where is your, and I know that gets a little tricky depending on the individual book, but as you're going backwards, like into the 90s, into the 80s, like, when did you get to the point where like a 9.6 is okay? You know what I mean? Is it like that early? I know the modern age feels like, I feel like you guys need an extra category of like ultra modern or something. Cause what is it? Modern age is like the mid 80s up until now. And I feel like that covers way
Oh,
too big
that's
of a
usually
graph.
copper. I think modern is probably around like I don't know the exact off the top of my head, but it's either late '90s, early or sorry, late '80s, early '90s is like the start of modern, and then that's
Okay.
what they just call them all the time because there's like it goes Bronze Age and there's Copper Age, that most
Oh
people
yeah, I forgot about copper. So like,
yeah.
so copper age into early modern. Like, at what point do you look at it? Is it like obviously like I don't know, like an ASM 300? I assume from an investment level, if you're looking at this purely from an investment side, like an ASM 300, something like that level. Like, what's the lowest grade you would feel comfortable getting into? Like, I assume something like that. A nine
If you're
six is
talking about
probably fine.
investments if you're talking about
Yeah.
investment, it really comes down to the point of the book. So, like, a Spider-Man 300's first Venom, so that's gonna be much higher in demand, so you can go a much lower grade and still
Okay.
have it in demand. But if you say went a little higher than that and went issue, 303, nothing special about that, I would say you need a 9.8 to a 9.6. Like, you might be able to pass as a 9.4, but I would suggest get a 9.8 of that. Like, that's gonna be your investment grade is a 9.8 of that. Sure, if you can't afford it, maybe a 9.6 or even a 9.4, but anything lower than that, don't even bother, right? But it depends on the key. Like, and then if you go up a little higher to 316, first Venom cover, 9.8, yes, 9.6, yes, 9.4, maybe 9.2, like 9.0 is like, I wouldn't
Yeah.
for that investment. So it really depends on the key and the book itself. But if it's
So
like
if
a
it's like a banger blue chip key, going down a couple points in grade, even on something within the last 20 to 30 years, is still pretty okay. Obviously, get the best grade that financially make sense for you. But
Yeah, like Ultimate Fallout 4, first Miles Morales. He's, a very popular character. So a 98 is going to run you about 2,500 bucks, somewhere around there. Like, not everyone can afford that, but he's still going to be. There's enough demand that there's enough people that don't have the big pockets to want to buy him. So you could go down to like a 9.0 in that book, right? I wouldn't suggest it. I would suggest to stay at least a 9.4, but you can. Now, would you get an 8.0? Is that an investment grade? No, it's not an investment grade. That's
yeah.
just I want to have it grade.
And then, so like going backwards on that scale, like we were talking pre-stream, like I just recently bought a giant size X-Men #1, something like that. From an investment standpoint, like if someone's entering into the market and they're like I recognize giant size X-Men #1 or something on that same tier as giant size X-Men #1, is it literally like a book like that or like a Hulk 181? Is it pretty much like legitimately almost any grades like an investment level grade, or like do you still have like try to get like a 4.0 or better that presents well or something like
I
that?
still have suggestions, but you can still they're still in such high demand that you can get a 2.0 of the book and still be fine. But I do have suggestions on that book. Usually, what happens is someone comes to me and like, "Oh, I want to get into investing. What should I invest in?" I'm like, "Well, tell me your budget," and then they tell me your budget, and then I can like tell them, guide them based off of that. It's like, well, you could get this one really nice book, or do you want a bunch of little books? It really all depends. But like, there's lots of good investments out there. It's like if someone came to you and it's like, "What stock should I invest in?" It's just like,
Mhm.
"Well, there's lots of stocks. You can invest in this, this, this. These are all good stocks. Who's going to go up more? I have no idea. Like, is Tesla or Amazon going to go up more? I have no idea. Like, I can't predict the future, but I can tell you that both options are good."
Yeah. So I'm going to circle back to Ultimate Fallout 4. To me, when I came in and started putting money in the comic book market, that was like around that time period was like my line of like, I don't really want to invest in anything post around that era.
Hmm.
Because it seems like the modern, so like the ultra modern side of things, like the last 10 to 15 years, is so variant cover driven. And that, I mean, and like I said, I'm looking at this more as like an outsider perspective. To me, a lot of those feel like a trap. Like I just don't know how many of those are really going to hold value long term. I mean, I know that Ultimate Fallout 4 has a variant cover that's astronomically priced, but
Oh
in
yeah,
general, like the stuff coming out today, it's just like, oh, well, there's cover A, cover B, cover C, cover D, 16 different store exclusives, this, that, and the other thing. And it's just like, which one of those is actually going to, if it is actually a book that matters, like what is going to be the one that actually is the one that holds value when you have so many different options to go to?
so here's a good example. Todd McFarlane just came out with King Spawn 1. And he was going to do, this is going to be my rarest retailer's incentive. He says, if you own a comic shop, you order X amount of comics. I think it was 250 of King Spawn 1. I'll give you this special King Spawn. He had no idea it was going to sell 500,000 copies. So, which then made that rare thing. Now it was one of 1,700. He made 1,700 of them, of these rare 1 and 250s. I always tell people, if you're going to go the variant route, get the rarest one and make sure it's not a retailer's incentive. And this is one. If you buy 25, I'll give you this incentive book. Or if you buy 50, that's a retailer's incentive. I say go to the ones where they say, we have a print run of X and that's all we're making. Those I feel like are the best. But then it comes down to, is that the core of that comic going to be worth anything in the future? Right. So, for example, I bought The Last Ronin, which is a Turtles comic book series that's out. They had 1,000 variants, right? They're the only ones I went for were they only had a print run of 100 to 150. There's two variants that had 150 and another one had 100. Those are the only two because I know exactly how many they're out. I have three of them of the 100, so I know there's only 97 possible left, right, out there. And so those are the ones you want to go for. Now, will The Last Ronin be something great? That I don't know. That depends on the story, depends how much gets pumped. Do they make a movie based off it? Do they make a TV show off it? All this stuff. That I can't tell you, but I can tell you if you go down the new route, go for the rarest of the rare of that comic.
And what about, I'm going to tie this specifically to Ultimate Fallout 4 because it's the one that it sticks in my mind the most. What's your take on like a second print on something like that? Because now that one's a little different because it does have a unique cover. It's not just a straight second print. You know, it has
Yeah.
one shows his face versus doesn't. But like, do you view something as like Ultimate Fallout 4 second print as like viable? Like, will it just sure you're going to get in at a lower entry point and it has a lower ceiling than like obviously the true first print does. But in a case like that, is that something that you would consider like, okay, you can invest money into the second print, or is that
So
something you would stay away from?
so usually the second printing, sometimes they have 3, 4, 5 printings. The only printing like, this is the first printing, but the only time another printing can have actual value is when they do, like it could be a second printing, or it could be like a, a 3rd or 4th printing, but they print, like, a very small quantity of it for some odd reason. It's like, "Oh, let's do a print run of, like, 5,000." I think Ultimate Fallout 4 had a print run of, like, 80 or 90,000, right? And so then the second printing was probably like 25. But if they did a second printing and it was like 5,000, and then a lot of those didn't make it from 2004, I think it came out, then that could be like, oh, it's kind of rare right now. Or say there's only 2,000 that exist. That makes it kind of rare. Um, I tend to stay away from print runs that have a lot of them, like second print runs that are like 25, and the first one was like 1,000. They still will have value, like the Ultimate Fallout 4, because it's people that can't get the top grade of Ultimate Fallout 4, they'll go for the lesser, but that's all it is this people can afford it, so they go for the lesser,
Yeah,
but
that just to be very specific on that, but I know a lot of people do like that cover better. Like the second, a lot of people actually just like the second print cover better from a collector standpoint, anyway.
yeah, it shows his face
Yeah,
as opposed
I mean,
to
personally, I try to stay away from the modern stuff as much as possible. Like I said, my cutoff line was like when I was buying stuff was like Ultimate Fallout 4 and like Edge of the Spider Verse 2, First Appearance of Spider Gwen, like around that era. Everything predating that is mostly what I looked at, and more when I dove in, I specifically thought a lot of the stuff in that 80s to 90s bracket looked extremely underpriced compared to where the rest of the comic book market was, just because of where your guys' census counts were at. You know, census counts in 3,000, you guys were viewing as high. And I was looking at that as going, that's really not that much. And if a bunch of new people come into the market, even something at like that high of a census count could escalate quickly, which we ended up seeing, like with New Mutants 98, ASM 316, which is one you mentioned before, was another one that, like, you know, that stuff was just like doubling overnight, it almost felt like.
so it's the census is great, but it comes down to it. What it all comes down to is supply and demand. So it doesn't matter if a New Mutants 98 has 1,000,000 copies. If there's 2,000,000 people that want it, then the price goes up. And so stuff that's like has like, oh, there's a census of 98 and it has 300. Well, that doesn't really tell me much. Depends on the book. Is there a lot of demand for that book? Is there a lot of people wanting that book? And I feel like in cards, you guys have a higher end clientele. Like you have some people that will spend a lot more on cards overall than they will on comics, because it was the highest price was like a Mike Trout was like 5 million bucks or something like that.
That's been eclipsed now by some vintage stuff, but yeah, like the highest end cards are like 3 to 5 million
Yeah,
essentially.
and the
I mean, there's
highest
not
end,
that many. You know, that's a handful of cards that have sold for that
but
price.
the
But
highest end comics are in the 2 to 3 million. So like you almost nearly double ours. But that means that you're gonna have way more. You might have like 20 cards in the $1 to $2 million range, while we only have like 3 comics in the $1 to $2 million range, maybe 4, right? So you guys have more people that are willing to spend more money, I think. So like maybe you see a population that seems low, but for the comic world that might actually be high, because it's like, oh, there's not even enough people to want that book.
yeah, yeah, that no, that completely makes sense. And I talk about something similar to that on the sports card side of things too, because you'll see where certain parallels of a card, like different variation, like think variant covers, will be much lower pop, but will sell less than some of the other ones because the other ones just have more demand to them, even though
Yeah.
it's a higher on the census counter. We call it population reports on the sports card side of things. But I was just looking at it saying like if any new money comes into this market, there's not as much supply as it appears that there is. Any influx of people coming in on a 3,000 census book is going to drive the demand a lot faster than the normal market would, on the
Yeah.
demand side, if that makes sense. Because all of a
Yeah.
sudden you have this bunch of new money coming into the market that wasn't previously there, which I think is which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. I think that is what caused some of the prices to go up because
Yeah.
there were a lot of new money coming in,
Yeah. I think that's,
pushing those prices.
like even my brother, he sold his company, and he came to me. He's like, "I want to diversify. What comic should I buy?" I'm like, "Buy this, 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 and this." And he bought multiple Hulk 181s, multiple X Men, giant size X Men ones. I think a Fancy 15. All the classic ones I suggest, and everyone's like, "Why don't you suggest DC?" I'm like, I'm telling people how to do, like, to make money. Not saying that DCs are bad. It's just that, like, if you're doing a strictly investment, I'm gonna go for the big guys that will hold their investment slash make you the most return. So it's just DCs don't tend to do that as much in the Silver
Yeah.
Age, Bronze Age.
Marvel has the Disney machine behind it, cranking out amazing content left and right. Like even their
Yeah,
duds are like good. A dud Marvel project is like top tier DC
yeah.
project.
I know.
I don't know
It's
how
tough.
they've managed to screw that up so bad. Like because
It's
they have good characters and stuff, but they just
it's
can't seem to
not.
get out of their own
I
way.
think what it is you have people making decisions that should have no interest, like that shouldn't even be involved in making decisions, but they're the money people, they're the owners of these companies, but they're making all the decisions and when they shouldn't be in charge. That's what it really comes down to. And they're like, no, but the data says that we must do this, this, and this. And like, yeah, that's when you paint by numbers, you get a paint by number movie that no one likes. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the comic market has cooled recently in some regards, but you say that globally on a macro level, it definitely has a lot of stuff that got huge run ups has come down. But on the flip side of things, to your point, like whatever the latest MCU spec still goes crazy. Like,
Yeah.
first appearance of Kang like a month ago was going, nuts.
It's still going
Whatever
up.
yeah, well, that would, yeah, yeah. And I would imagine that it would too, because he's going to be the next,
Villain.
he's the feature villain for a while now. So he's going to have some hype behind him for a while. So it's not like the market's dead or anything like that at all. Um, but do you think most of that stuff that spiked that we have seen those pullbacks and like we were both talking prior to recording, it does seem like a lot of stuff is starting to level out that had the big run ups. Do you think we're at the floor on some of that stuff now and it's going to kind of like
I
sit where it is until the next thing? Or do you think there's another like cliff coming for a lot of that stuff that
hope
had
it's
big
not
run
another
ups?
cliff.
I
It
mean,
really like
obviously, we're just all guessing, but just based off of what you're seeing in your experience.
based off what I'm seeing. Okay, so first of all, the comic market has never seen something like this ever before. I mean, has the card market seen something similar to this?
Like the early '90s boom, but it wasn't
Yeah,
even on
maybe the
this
early
level.
'90s, but not when I was. I was as a
Yeah, my entire lifetime, no, I've
yeah,
never seen
yeah.
anything like this.
So it's never seen anything like this. So to guess what's going to happen next, it's kind of like being in 2005, 2006 real estate and trying to guess what's gonna happen next. Like, or after the market's already gone down, you're like, "Oh, what's I don't know, is it leveling out? I have no idea." Like, I would from all the data that I see and being a dealer, what I see it leveling out, but not leveling out based off of demand, more leveling out because people don't wanna drop the prices. So, for example, if I had a book and it was worth $4,000 at the peak, and I'm like, okay, it's going down. Right now, it's at 3,000. Well, I, I'm not going to sell it for 2,000. Like I refuse. Like, but if I did, that would just drop the price even further on on the GPA. But I think a lot of people are just no, I'm not going to sell it. Like a lot of people are like, I'm done dropping my prices. Whether it's a dealer, whether it's someone that had the book and this need money, they want to get out. I think that is why, because it's not like it's rebounded in terms of like people buying tons of volume. But I think like overall, I think it's just kind of it's hitting that floor. And I think once it hits that floor and it's safe, I think all the people that are scared are gonna come back in, and it'll slowly build, you know? Uh, Usually what happens when there's, like, a crash, people are like, "Oh, no, I'm out," and then they just run away, right? And, what's that Warren Buffett saying,
Be
"Be
greedy when others are
greedy."
fearful.
Yep, that's the one. So, I mean, look at Bitcoin, right? Just look how people react with Bitcoin or Tesla. It's just like it's crashing, everyone jumps ship, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, it's back up 3 months later.
Bye, bye, bye. Yeah.
Yeah, bye, 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 and that's how people are very emotional, and it's only worth something until you sell it, right?
Yeah. So to your point that you just made, I can 100% speak to this. I just bought a giant size X-Men number one on a 7.0. I've been looking to buy one for 2 to 3 weeks now, and I had a lot of problems trying to find someone that wanted to sell to me at August prices and not wanting to sell at May and June prices.
Yeah, so people wouldn't drop their price.
Correct. Like I was looking at like say recent comps on eBay for like a 5.0 would be like 3 grand.
Yeah,
But 2 months ago they were 5 grand, to your point. So
yeah,
I would like, make the post in the buy sell trade groups or whatever, and people would be like, "Oh yeah, I have one." I'm like, "What's your price?" 5 grand. And I'm like,
yeah,
"Well, the last six have sold for three."
and
And
those
they're
are
like,
probably
"Yeah,
auctions.
but like the 90-day average, like whatever excuse they could make to like be
Yeah,
like, oh, but I want to sell it for more." And I'm like, well, I get that the 90-day average was this, but literally like a half a dozen have sold in the last 3 weeks at this price. Like, I don't think the 90-day average matters anymore. But I had a lot of problems trying to find someone that was willing to let one go at what I deemed, the current market price, and regardless of grade, because I wasn't set on a particular grade. I was like, okay, I want to be between a 5 and an 8 based on depending on the price of the book. Like that was my
yeah,
budget range. And whatever one I ran into at the price that I felt correct, I'd pull the trigger on. But I can't tell you how many people that I talk to or try to do a deal with, either on eBay, Facebook groups, whatever, that just were not willing to move one at close to current market
yeah.
prices.
Yeah, so what's happening is dealers and maybe even collectors or other just sellers, um, they're like, I'm willing to wait this out. Like they know that the sun's coming up the horizon pretty soon, so they're willing to just hold on to it, and they don't need to sell it. So what ends up happening is that at some point, the only time someone can buy one is if someone throws one up in auction, right? Or someone prices one really cheap because they need the money. So you just have a few of those. But then what's going to happen is someone's going to really want it, and they're like, "Nah, I don't really care. I'll pull the trigger on this high priced one," and then
And
that
then jump the
instantly,
comp.
yeah, it jumps the comp, and then the comps start coming up. I've already seen like Giant Size X Men took a real bad beating. I was surprised. Out of most of the ones that I saw, they saw took one of the biggest beatings. I think I've seen Hulk 181 slowly come back. And if you can look at the graphs, a lot of them is like way up, spike down, and then it's like slowly coming up. The volume still isn't there. And that's the thing. The volume with these books are nothing compared to what they were May and June, like number of sales.
Mhm.
But the prices are slowly leveling out, coming back. So,
Well, and I think too, this is very specific to like X-Men and X-Men properties. Anyone that's willing to hold long term knows what's coming. Like we all
yes.
know that they are going to be in the MCU. It might be 2 years before we even see a trailer or get casting, or
You're
even a
right.
year.
It'll be
Y-
2 years before we get like some cryptic like announcement.
Yeah. But like legitimately, like the first time there's the slightest, the corner of a wheelchair in a trailer, you know, X-Men prices are going to go I mean, look at like what some of these like random Avengers characters and bit character like Morbius books went crazy based, and that show was great, don't get me wrong. But
Mhm.
like, prices based off Loki, like Loki side characters went crazy. I can't imagine what's going to happen when we actually get proper X-Men in the MCU. Like to me,
Yeah.
all that stuff is just going to go absolutely
So to
bonkers.
your point, I've been holding back Hulk 181s, Hulk 180s, and giant size X-Men ones. Like just tons of them. Like I will not sell them. I sold one because kind of needed a little money and someone really wanted one. And I was like, okay, we did a deal. But outside of that, it's like if I ever showcase one, like in one of my videos, And I get hit up, "Hey, is that for sale? Is that for sale?" I'm like, "No, that's going back. That's going in the vault, and you won't see that. You won't see those books until there's a little more headway with X-Men in the MCU and Wolverine and all that kind of stuff. Because I know what's coming. I know that these books, like I've been around the block. It's crazy to me how much these prices. I have some books back, some Hulk 180 ones, no joke. I bought for $600, and I'm talking about like four O's. What is those? Those are like 2, 3, 4 grand now. I don't know.
I think they're a little because that's what the next one that I was going to start looking at was a 181. I think like a 5.5 is going for about 5 to 6K. So whatever a 4.0 would
Exactly.
go based off that.
And the thing is with those books is they're going to see the biggest drops, but also the biggest gains because those are at the perfect point where people that a lot of times people collect based off an emotional connection with something. Like you said, you wanted X Men because you grew up watching the Pride of the X Men, and so that's why you have a connection with X Men. So right around the people that are going to be like kids are out or grown, they have a little extra spending money, they're doing pretty good in their jobs. That's when they're going to have a little extra money to spend. They're going to go remember as a kid, and then they're going for the big ones. And then on top of that, investors are going to be like, "What should I get? Hulk 181, Giant Size X-Men 1, Fantasy 15." So they're going to go for those books. So those are just going to see, and it's gonna be like how it was in like May, just like, oh, it's 4,000 this month. Oh, next month it's 6,000. Next month, it's like a 50% gain, 25% gain per month.
Yeah.
And so
And,
that's
and
how I kind of see it.
and the thing with X-Men too is you have to imagine they're probably going to anchor like phase 5 of the MCU. Like when they come, they're going to be around for a while. It's
Yeah,
not just going to be like, oh, okay, here's the one off or two off Ant-Man and the Wasp movie or Guardians of
yeah,
the Galaxy, and they're like a bit player. I mean, when X-Men come to the MCU, they are going to be the MCU. Like
yeah.
in my mind, I imagine that a lot of the Avengers stuff gets handed off, and then the X-Men kind of carry,
It
the
might
next
be a
round.
Avengers versus an X-Men movie.
Yeah, I mean, and I think people forget because the MCU is ingrained like, oh, like Iron Man and the Avengers are the most popular characters. Well, actually, I mean, prior to the MCU, the X-Men were the backbone of Marvel. Like they
Yeah,
were the
minus
most
Spider-Man.
popular thing. Yeah, and Spider-Man. Yes, of course, Spider-Man. But I mean, the X-Men were like one of their main pillars. Way almost any X-Men character was more popular than Iron Man prior to, Robert
Oh,
Downey
yeah.
Jr. putting the suit on.
In the 90s, X-Men, they couldn't even make enough X-Men titles. X-Men anything. That's why you get there's like a bazillion X
Yeah.
titles of like different X-Men, all spin-offs. X-Men were like, which is really funny because they actually got canceled originally. They
Hmm.
it, they were canceled after issue 66 or 67, I can't remember. They kind of canceled, but they didn't want to get rid of them, so they just did reprints until Giant Size X-Men
Nice
1,
as
which turned
X-Men.
into X-Men 94, and that was the first new X-Men. But yeah, they weren't that popular back in the day.
But I just can't imagine what that stuff looked like. How I just think to your point, there's going to be a lot of people in that age, like my age bracket, that when the X-Men come to the MCU, it's going to hit different than Iron Man and Thor and Captain
Oh
America
yeah,
coming to the MCU.
Iron Man was always a B, C list character, and that's why they used him. Because they licensed out all their other characters.
Yeah.
Spider-Man was licensed out, X-Men was licensed out, the Hulk was licensed out. They didn't really have many people left. Namor was even licensed out. They never used him, but I think the Black Panther might have been licensed. A lot of their main characters licensed out, and they just had, well, let's do Iron Man. Like he's big enough, but not that big, and that's just started it.
Yeah, they just got lucky on the casting because Robert Downey Jr. was like the perfect. He
Well, he was
basically is Tony Stark.
Yeah, he was the perfect, and he was coming off of like a bad rap with his alcoholism and drugs, and no one wanted to cast him. And people forget he won an Academy Award for Charlie Chaplin, like 5, 10 years prior, but he had all of his issues, and so he had like a rebirth. It just worked out like perfectly. So
Yeah, but I just cannot imagine what to your point earlier, like what the GPA graph's going to look like the first time we get a Cajun shuffling a deck of cards in the side of a cameo appearance or something on some random movie
well,
pointing towards the next thing.
here's the thing that the The thing that sucks about comics is it leans so heavily on this pop culture, movies, TV shows, all this kind of stuff. But the movies and TV shows have to be good because if you look at Marvel Superheroes 13, first Captain Marvel, it did not generate the buzz with the people that were actually to buy the comics enough that the book just went up and this went down, right? Um, and that's why I always say like with Carnage coming to the Venom movie or the Eternals, I'm like, it really depends. Like if this movie sucks, then the book's gonna not really go anywhere. It has to be good enough where they're like, let's make a 2, a 3, a 4, and it just really resonates with people where they're like, I need to buy that book because I'm in love with Black Panther. I'm in love with Peter Quill. I'm in love with whatever. So that's how. But if it's like movies, like whatever, then the book will drop.
Yeah, and the weird part is going back to our conversation earlier about like DC, Marvel really hasn't had a dud like in the grand scheme of things. Like
Mm-mm.
when Captain Marvel is your biggest air quotes dud, like that's still doing pretty damn good.
Oh yeah, it's.
So that you would think that they would be due for something to flop just based on like the law of averages at some point in time.
I think they have too much of a big fan base that you can't they can't flop like money wise or anything. They just can't because they've proven themselves time and time. They might have a movie that's like like Thor 2. It's like right?
Yeah, they're
Nothing.
almost too big to fail.
Yeah. And DC hasn't really proven itself. Like it has like one good movie every like 4 or 5. You know, it's like honestly, it's like what was the last best DC movies? Like
Wonder Woman probably.
Wonder Woman 1, not number
Yeah,
2.
one specifically. Yeah, not two.
Yeah, but if you go prior to that, so the Dark Knight series, but that wasn't even part of the DCEU. I mean, you
Yeah.
maybe some people Man of Steel. I mean, Shazam was pretty good, but money-wise, it didn't make as much.
Well, and now you have like Disney and Marvel are basically like a fully operational Death Star with Disney Plus now, which probably makes the comic book market really even more like on steroids because there's going to be it's not like you're waiting for movies anymore. You know, you're getting
Yeah.
these constant 6 episode series. Now we have What If, which is really sending things in crazy places. Like you're really starting to get into this much more niche characters, niche arcs, like these really
Yeah.
in the weeds things now that you weren't seeing even 2 years ago in the MCU because of Disney Plus.
Also, on top of that, you have Disneyland and Disney World. They have Marvel Land, at Disney one of them. I don't know which one, and you got the Star Wars Land and all that kind of stuff. They'll have an X-Men Land.
Oh,
Like
100%.
yeah, like they're on this big picture idea, and like who knows? There's also maybe TV shows based off of things like that. With CGI getting to the point where you could do it cheaply, you could make a good series. I mean, look at The Mandalorian. I mean, I love that
Yeah, that's all
series.
filmed on a soundstage and it looks amazing.
Yeah, it does. So it's like with things getting cheaper and able to do it, before it's like CGI costs these you needed those $200 million budgets to do it. Now it's like, oh, you can do something that's convincing for a lot cheaper, you know? So,
Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up on that. We've been going for almost an hour here, so I don't want to keep David too long here. I'll throw it back to David real quick. Let the people know where they can find you and your content. I know that you have the YouTube channel and you also have a band too, right?
yeah, I have a band, Love Angeles is the band. Um, yeah, doing that for a long, long, long time as well. But yeah, you can find me on, YouTube, Comic Book Investments, or I have a website, collectorscomics.com.
And you're what, nearly, what are you about, daily, close to daily on videos? At least what, 5 times a week, give or take?
I definitely tried, daily. I would say daily. I do a video every day.
But yeah, highly encourage you guys checking out David content. Once again, he has a very unique perspective because he's coming at it from a dealer, so he has skin in the game, if you will, and has a perspective that I don't think a lot of other people do. So go check out his content. I'll link to everything in the description down below. And with that being said, we will catch you guys and girls on the next one. Peace.
All right, thanks.